Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot to dive into in this episode of the podcast. We'll talk more about the national unity crisis Canada is facing at the moment, some provocative new research out of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, in conjunction with some polling they've done on how Canadians feel about some of the imbalance or unfairness that exists in this country. How real are some of these grievances, and where should we focus our efforts when it comes to building up national unity? We're going to hear from Mark Milke, he's president and founder of the Aristotle Foundation, and he makes a provocative case that maybe it's time to call the bluff on Quebec separatism and start to really focus our efforts on addressing Western separatism and some of these Western grievances. We'll get into all of that coming up in a moment with Mark Milke. Also today, we'll talk about the inflation challenge Canada is facing, especially in light of soaring oil and gas prices. This week, the Bank of Canada decided to hold the line on interest rates amid all of this global uncertainty. But of course, so much of this is out of the hands of the Bank of Canada, really almost beyond the reach of monetary policy. The oil shock resulting from this conflict in the Middle East. We're going to hear a little bit later on from Steve Ambler. He's David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy of the CD Howe Institute. We'll talk about this challenge facing the economy right now and where monetary policy fits in. I mean, even before we've seen this surge in oil prices, we've really been dealing with persistent food inflation. And if oil prices are going to rise, gasoline prices are going to rise, that's going to trickle down even further to food prices too. So there's probably only so much the Bank of Canada can do right now when it comes to using interest rates and other monetary policy tools to rein in this inflation we're about to face. Now, interestingly, the inflation rate was actually down to 1.8% in February, but nobody's expecting that to last. And we're all expecting to see a real increase as a result of what we're seeing right now with global oil prices. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about all of that coming up later on, where this is all headed, what, if anything, we can do about it, what kind of impact that's going to have on the bottom line of Canadians and on the economy as well. Well, amid a renewed focus on Western alienation and a debate happening in Alberta, of course, Albertans will be voting in October on a number of referendum questions, including some along constitutional reform. There's an interesting new report out from the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy looking at the question of representation in Parliament, how Canadians feel about their own representation, where we see imbalance, and what kind of a willingness there is on the part of Canadians to try to address this. It's called Unequal and Uneven Representation, Facts on Canada's Parliament. You can read much more at aristotlefoundation.org. We're joined on the program to discuss this in more detail by Mark Milke, he is founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. Mark, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
I think, the whole issue of having a voice and whether it feels like we're contributing to decisions made in this country is driving a lot of the conversation where we are here in Alberta. And I know it's a concern for a lot of Canadians beyond just the West. But what was the impetus, first of all, for conducting this survey and doing this deep dive on this question?
Well, I've suspected for some time that Quebec separatism may ramp up, and that will drive Western separatism. And look, I'm a true born and bred British Columbian. I'm pro-Canada. We didn't found the Aristotle Foundation, which is a cross-country organization, to split up Canada. Nonetheless, as a born and bred Westerner, British Columbian, I voted against the Charlottetown Accord in 1992. Some people may remember that because it had special status for Quebec. And so I sensed a dynamic was coming where as I mentioned, if Quebec separatism ramps up, and it may because of the Parti Québécois getting back into power later this year, as the polls indicate it might, that will drive Western frustrations ahead. And then you've got a problem from both sides of the country. Plus, I do think a lot of the Western grievances, if you want to put it that way, are highly legitimate, unlike Quebec's grievances over the decades, right? So Quebec discriminates against the English language. It discriminates against minorities. It wants to stop pipelines across the country that go through Quebec. Westerners, especially in Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan, have more of a pro-development agenda, I would argue, at least the majority of the population. Plus, they're not trying to interfere in other jurisdictions. They're not trying to outlaw the French language. So I think there are distinct differences between Western frustrations, and in some cases, which morphs into separatism, and Quebec separatism. So the idea of a poll from Leger, where they polled 2,700 people across the country, so we get provincial breakdowns, and then our accompanying study showing, look, how underrepresented are some provinces or overrepresented, came from that recognition that we haven't talked about the Constitution of Canada for some decades now. It's been off the radar. It may come back in.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, just as backdrop to all of this, there was periodically a review of the seat count in the House of Commons. And I guess it's worth noting Alberta did receive some additional seats, three, I believe. But there was also a recommendation to take a seat away from Quebec, and the government wanted nothing to do with that. So it's maybe a little bit of a baby step in rectifying some of this. But I think a lot of those underlying issues really remain, don't they?
Well, they do. And there's all sorts of weird constitutional legal formulas. PEI is guaranteed the same number of seats as it has senators, that sort of thing. And it becomes a bit of a witch's brew to try and improve the House of Commons representation. And what we did is we looked back, through the decades, and you'll find that, of course, Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta have been chronically underrepresented for decades because of those formulas and other things. And you constantly have to add to the House of Commons rather than redistribute seats. And that's one of the things we asked in the Leger poll of all Canadians. And remarkably, actually, a large majority of Canadians, 66% in the Leger poll, said they actually think riding should be closer to equal, in terms of the population count in each riding than is the case. And they may not know this, the Canadians who answered that question affirmatively, but that's actually the model that's common and practiced in Great Britain, in Australia, New Zealand, in other words, other Anglosphere countries like our own. And we're way off the charts, unrepresentative in Canada in terms of per riding counts. But Australia, I think the bandwidth is about 5%, that sort of thing. You actually find in the UK, whereas ours is about 25% differences between major urban ridings, never mind rural. And you'll find, for example, the United Kingdom regularly redistributes seats in the House of Commons there rather than add to the House of Commons. And I think Wales lost some seats a few years back, Scotland did, and more were added to England proper. So it's not it's not radical to suggest that the House of Commons in particular should be more representative of the population, because that's what it's designed to be, right? Now, the Senate's another question, which again, there's court rulings, there's precedent, there's all sorts of things from 1867 forward that make it more difficult to reform, as we know. But if you're sitting in British Columbia, you have one senator for every almost 1 million people. In Quebec, the number is about a third of that, 300,000 and change. And so British Columbians actually should be the most annoyed, but also Ontarians. They're underrepresented in the Senate and in the House of Commons as well. And I don't think that's always recognized in Western Canada, that Ontario's put up with underrepresentation as well.
Yeah, that's true. And it's funny because in a way, I mean, like I think you alluded to, provincial boundaries shouldn't really matter when it comes to the House of Commons. It's essentially where the population is. So we can see on average what each riding in Canada represents in terms of population. And we do see a real variation in those numbers. Alberta, BC, Ontario, right up there at the top above the national average. So it does vary quite a bit. And I guess that speaks to some of these sort of historical quirks and promises and guarantees that kind of skew all of this.
Well, on the slow moving machine that is reform. So, and the preference to add seats to the House of Commons rather than redistribute, as the United Kingdom does. So, yeah, I remember the last edition, or at least maybe the second last edition to the House of Commons when the Harper government was in, that it was about to be, I think seats were about to be added to Alberta, Ontario, and BC, and then Quebec complained because it was, I think, for like half a millisecond was underrepresented
Right.
when the calculations came out. But of course, chronically, it's the other three provinces that are underrepresented because the population growth is always there. And this, by the way, is a consistent pattern. And you'll see this column in the National Post in the coming days as well from myself, pointing out that Quebec separatists should, if you want to save the country, don't preach about unity in the way that Jean Charest did in 1995 with respect to Jean Charest or Jean Chrétien. I don't think that's going to work this time. I think there's great frustrations in the West and perhaps parts of Ontario about Quebec separatism. And if Quebec separatists raise their head a third time and demand a referendum or demand more from the rest of Canada, the column that accompanies this study that will be in the National Post also points out that, look, Quebec is a declining portion of the population. It used to be, I think in the 1995 referendum, it was around 90 or 27, 29%. I'm going from memory here, but it's in the column. And it's now down to about 22% in terms of the proportion of the population. And so meanwhile, Alberta, Ontario, Western Canada more generally, if you just look at the four provinces, are a much greater share of the country's population than they used to be. So my advice in the column, the coming column in the National Post, is the rest of the country should pay close attention if tensions ramp up this year to Quebec separatists and to Western frustrations, not just the separatists alone. And they should turn down Quebec separatists because there's a declining. Let me back up. I think Quebec's bluff, the separatist bluff in Quebec, should be called by people in the province, by people outside of that province, because they're a declining share of the population. Quebec is in Canada. Plus, if you look at the demographics in Quebec, you may remember the 1995 referendum night where Jacques Parizeau, the Parti Québécois leader, blamed the close loss on ethnics, right? He was being crude, but his analysis wasn't wrong. But the ethnic population in Quebec has soared since then. It's going to be a majority by 1950, and they don't vote, and neither do the English speakers in Quebec, for separation. So in other words, I think it's time to call the separatist bluff in Quebec and pay a little bit more attention to where the growth has happened in this country, which is both Ontario and Western Canada, and make sure that the legitimate grievances are addressed in Western Canada.
Well, any kind of constitutional reform is a challenge, to say the least, in this country, with competing interests and, of course, the formula underlying it. Alberta, I think, is hoping to move the ball along a little bit with these referendum votes coming up on October 19th. I mean, one of them is to abolish the Senate altogether, which is interesting and provocative. But what does this survey tell us about where public opinion is at in terms of an openness to have these conversations?
Well, of course, there's more than just constitutional change that can be done, because you're right, that's the toughest part of this. But the Leger poll that we commissioned, again, and you can find it at aristotlefoundation.org, found that there was a greater proportion of Canadians open to dealing with demands from Western separatists, for lack of a better description, or at least the grievances out west, than Quebec. So 55% in the case of the West and 49%. That's not a huge margin, but it tells you something. And if you look at the Ontario numbers, again, there's a slight difference between those in Ontario willing to look out west and go, okay, I think there may be some legitimate things we can deal with there and should deal with vis-a-vis Quebec. And that's, again, it's just a gut feel, Rob. I don't have a scientific, proof of this, but I suspect after two referendums from Quebec that the country may be like, and again, with the growth in Western Canada, the economy here, the population, that there may be more of a willingness to dicker a little bit with legitimate Western grievances. Not all grievances are legitimate anywhere, but there are some things out west that are not constitutional that can be dealt with. So stop blocking pipelines, that sort of thing. I mean, all the stuff you and I have talked about and others have talked about for some time, especially in this world, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't have more pipelines, oil and natural gas crisscrossing the country, exporting to Europe, exporting to Asia, in a world that's gone crazy and at war. So I think there's things that can be done to mollify the West through legislation and policy changes. The tougher part, would be representation that would require constitutional changes, or at least some changes to representation would, looking ahead.
Well, yeah, I think, as you know, I mean, a lot of these concerns or grievances are sort of economic in nature, or pertain to things like pipelines, or even the issue of federal transfers. And I know this survey does touch on that, because I guess ultimately, at the end of the day, feeling like you have a voice or feeling like you have representation, I mean, it does touch on all of these aspects. How do you see all of this tying together?
Well, if I were the rest of the country, if I can put it that way, if you can put a person as the rest of the country, and again, someone who was born and raised in British Columbia, who lives in Alberta now, who gets Western sentiment, I would advise the rest of the country not to take lightly the frustrations in Western Canada. And just because there are quasi-low poll numbers now 20 to 30% in favor of separation in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the numbers change, of course, according to the poll. If I were in the rest of the country, Central Canada, Eastern Canada, I would not flip away the frustrations out in the West, because historically, look at the numbers that consumed the country for Quebec separation. René Lévesque and the Parti Québécois get elected in 1976 in Quebec with 41% of the vote. Separation is endorsed in 1980 with only 40%. So the poll numbers you've seen in some polls for Saskatchewan, Alberta in particular, what happens if you get a charismatic leader leading some separation movement in the West, or in Alberta or Saskatchewan? And don't forget British Columbia, like I mentioned, because British Columbians hate special status for Quebec. That was a major reason they voted against the Charlottetown Accord in 1992, more than any other province, including Alberta. 68% of BCers said no to the Charlottetown Accord versus 60% in Alberta. and kind of post-game analysis from academics showed that a large part of that was driven by, I don't want Quebec to get special status. That's why I voted against it. So I think if I were the rest of the country, be very careful about taking for granted the frustrations in Western Canada. The timber is there, the fuel's on the fire. That doesn't mean you have to, deal with unreasonable demands. Or even give everything to the West that Quebec has gotten. You don't want the provinces to be, or Ottawa to, as Pierre Trudeau called them, to be a headwaiter to the provinces either. But there are some legitimate things that the federal government and others can do to, I think, meet legitimate Western grievances, and at the same time, take a pretty narrow eye at any demands coming out of the province of Quebec in the future.
It's interesting, and maybe a part of it's a consequence of what's happening globally, but we see other surveys that show there's increased support right across the board for building things like pipelines. I mean, this particular survey shows that there's a willingness in other parts of the country to negotiate, to find some solutions to address some of these grievances. Do you feel like we're starting to see a change in that direction?
I think so. And I think the Leger poll we commissioned shows that. So I think there's a reasonable understanding that there are some legitimate frustrations and they should be dealt with. So, and even in parts of the country where, it's not necessarily in their best interest or very narrow political interest to have reform. If you're sitting in Atlantic Canada and you favor more people, more equal ridings that are more equal in terms of population, that actually weighs against the immediate self-interest of Atlantic Canadians, because they're overrepresented, if I can use that term, in the House of Commons in terms of population per seat. Nonetheless, even a majority of Atlantic Canadians favor more equal seats in terms of population. So that tells me something. There is a sense of fairness out there, or an awareness of a frustration. Now, when push comes to shove, will those numbers hold up? Well, we'll see in terms of, through constitutional negotiations or changes in legislation, or will politicians just compromise by, doubling the seats in the House of Commons to assuage the West and keep the seats there for Atlantic Canada, Quebec that are there already. We'll see. I do think that the poll and also the analysis we published at the Aristotle Foundation shows that, there's an awareness that not everything is the way it should be in terms of federal policy for the country.
It's interesting. You think back to '92 and the Charlottetown Accord referendum, and of course, we saw the rise of the Reform Party in the West. The West wants in. We saw the rise of the PQ and the BQ in Quebec, which led to the '95 referendum. So, we had both Quebec separatism and Western frustration and alienation surging at the same time, almost in a way like we do today.
Yeah.
What are the lessons here? I mean, as you say, if governments try to appease Quebec separatists and appease Western separatists, that's probably not going to work. There's an inherent tension there.
No, and in fact, the big difference, and I think, as I mentioned, is not only in the demands from Quebec separatists historically vis-a-vis Western grievances, which I think were much more legitimate and are today. I think the dynamic has changed. And this is why I urge people not to, again, I'm not endorsing Western separatism. I'm not that. But I get the grievances out here. And so why I wouldn't downplay it as well, when you think about the difference between Alberta and Quebec, and even some of the people joining the separatist movement in Alberta in particular, and perhaps Saskatchewan, but especially Alberta, there's money in Alberta in a way that there's not in Quebec. And what I mean by that is the most dangerous point for any kind of separatist movement in any country is if the richer part of the country gets annoyed, because put aside all the, all the constitutional blocks to leaving, or judicial blocks to leaving rulings, put aside the CPP, put aside all that stuff that people want to debate over. This is not just about numbers and cents, and people need to understand that. A Western separatist movement, like the Quebec separatist movement, is driven by a notion of fairness. It's driven by passion. It's like a crowd on the street that's angry. And if you simply say, oh, behave, go away, wrong answer, right? They will rumble over you. So, and especially in the case of Alberta, I would take it seriously in this sense. There are people with money here who I know that I've met who were not separatists 5 years ago, CEOs and others, who have personal fortunes, who have company fortunes, and they're frustrated. And your reference to the 80s and the Reform Party, but if you're out West, you understand this almost intuitively, you're almost born with this, but you understand the Western frustrations historically. The National Energy Program under Pierre Trudeau, which forced the West to sell its oil at a discount to the rest of the country. And then the response to that was the Mulroney government. When the Mulroney government favored Quebec on CF-18 or whatever it was in 1996 in Winnipeg and took it away from a Western firm and gave it to Quebec, that precipitated the rise of the Reform Party and more frustration. And then you've got the Harper government. So Westerners, at least those attracted to separation, will say, listen, we've tried everything to be good to this country. And we keep getting snubbed by Ottawa, or we get people like Justin Trudeau who just want to kill the West and kill Alberta, to put not too fine a point on it. And you combine that frustration with people who have money who are willing to finance separatist movements. I wouldn't necessarily discount that as potent, because it is. Unlike Quebec, where it's the poorest part of the country, or one of the poorest parts of the country, and you don't have that kind of money sloshing around in favor of separatism. You simply don't. The CEOs that would finance it, that will here and are. So that's the difference between the two dynamics. I mean, look at Spain, or look at Northern Italy. The separatist movement in the Basque region comes from the wealthiest part of the country. And they could easily say, we don't want Southern Spain, goodbye, right? If that takes off. Northern Italy, I don't think there's a nascent separatist movement at that point, but they're frustrated with kind of the poorer part of the country that sometimes they would argue is that by choice. So the dynamic, or even non-rich areas, I'm not sure what Scotland's per GDP is vis-a-vis England, but the Brexit movement, where they didn't want to be told what to do by Europe and by Brussels. People wrote that off as deplorable, so to speak, to use Hillary Clinton's language. That was a mistake. There were some legitimate frustrations, and not all economic, which again I have to emphasize. In the case of the UK, it was about immigration. They thought was out of control, and that they were not in control of their own destiny. So the numbers and cents, people can throw those numbers around as much as they want, but actually the numbers and cents in some ways will be thrown back at you in terms of there's wealth out here, but there's also arguments for fairness. There's a passion that develops if you think you've been treated unfairly. And people need to watch for that dynamic in the next 6 to 9 months in Canada, in both sides of this, in Quebec and in Alberta. I just happen to think that Quebec demands historically are pretty illegitimate and based in illiberalism.
Well, much more, the survey, the analysis, AristotleFoundation.org. Mark Milke, thank you so much for joining us here today. Appreciate this.
Anytime, Rob. Thank you.
All right, and our thanks once again to Mark Milke. He is founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, AristotleFoundation.org. You can read their latest analysis, the polling that goes along with it, and what it all means for national unity in this country and how the federal government needs to respond to where to focus their efforts. Certainly a unique challenge for the federal government right now to deal with what's happening in Quebec, the likely return of the PQ and a possible referendum there. And then again, what's happening out west, and in particular in Alberta, where we've got these series of referendum questions coming up on October 19th, but also the likelihood that Alberta separation will be on the ballot, depending what happens with this petition campaign that Alberta separatists are engaged in right now. So Mark Milke's warning for the federal government and for Canadians in general, not to ignore what's happening in Alberta, to take it seriously, take those complaints, those grievances seriously, and hopefully we can see some movement on some of these issues. Now, it's an interesting segue into another bit of news this week concerning Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre appearing on the world's most popular podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. Yes, indeed, Poilievre in the U.S. this week. He was in Texas, he was in Austin, and everybody was speculating if he's in Austin, Texas, he must be doing The Joe Rogan Show, and indeed he did. And so Thursday, the video, it's like 2.5 hours. I haven't had a chance to watch all of it, but certainly the snippets I've seen, I mean, Poilievre does come across well. I think it's an opportunity to use the platform that podcast offers to make the case for Canada, to make the case for free trade between Canada and the U.S., and even to some extent to convince the president to back off of the 51st state kind of rhetoric. So unique opportunity for Pierre Poilievre, and we'll see what some of the further reaction is here at home to this, because I think there are going to be some who just feel that maybe he shouldn't want anything to do with Joe Rogan and that whole program or the podcast. But look, it's got a massive audience, a massive following, and I think if done right, there's some real good that can come of it. One of the questions, by the way, that was put to Pierre Poilievre by Joe Rogan was about the possibility of Alberta separation. Here was Poilievre's answer to that.
Separating.
That won't happen.
What was that about?
It won't happen. Some people are frustrated
but they, you know, there's some legitimate frustrations. But at the end of the day, Canada's going to be united. And Albertans, I'm born and raised Alberta, and Albertans are seriously patriotic Canadians.
Very patriotic.
Yeah, they're great people, hardworking.
Some of the nicest people you ever
They
run
are
across.
great people in
Hardy.
Alberta. They are hardy people.
It's cold up there. They know how to survive.
Exactly. You got to be tough to survive the cold in
Yeah.
Canada. Carve a country like we have out of that cold weather on that big open land. But people just keep on going. And Alberta's got a real kind of rugged individualism.
Yes.
And people love their agriculture. There's great ranches in Alberta, beautiful grasslands in Saskatchewan.
Doesn't Brock Lesnar have a place up there?
I didn't know that.
I think Brock Lesnar
Really?
bought land in Alberta.
Really?
Yeah, I think he owns a ranch up there.
Actually, I had heard that from somebody.
Yeah,
I've never seen
he
him.
fell in love with it. Well, he's a big hunter as well. I
Right.
think he fell in love with it up there because it's so magnificent. It's so gorgeous.
Okay, an interesting exchange there between Pierre Poilievre and Joe Rogan. By the way, I believe it was actually Saskatchewan where Brock Lesnar had purchased some property and was now residing. Although I think he's got two sons, both of whom are currently playing hockey in Alberta. But I do believe it was Saskatchewan that Brock Lesnar, I guess, developed a fondness for and decided where that's where he wanted to live. So a little bit of an aside there. But the question on Alberta separation. Now, it's interesting that just as we heard a message from Mark Milke saying, don't dismiss Alberta separation, that you have Pierre Poilievre essentially saying, no, it's not going to happen. I think of the context of, speaking in the U.S. to an American podcast host and, some of what we've heard about MAGA or right-wing interest in Alberta separation, perhaps it's important for Pierre Poilievre to frame it that way. Look, say what you will about Pierre Poilievre. I think he understands the concerns in Alberta. I think he understands how real a lot of these grievances are. And so I don't think he's someone to just casually dismiss or flippantly dismiss the threat of Alberta separatism. But it was interesting to hear his answer on that question. And again, as mentioned, that podcast is now out, like I say, about 2.5 hours, a conversation between Joe Rogan and Pierre Poilievre. And so that's certainly making some news this week. So I think it was smart for him to do it. I think he came across well in terms of what I've seen. And if some good can come of it in terms of the relationship between Canada and the U.S., all the better. Of course, as it relates back to the issue of pipelines and oil and gas, I think everything we're seeing right now has led to some further impetus for building up Canada's capacity, building up production, building up the capacity to export that production, both in terms of trade disruptions with the U.S. and looking to diversify our trading partners. And I think right now in a situation where, wouldn't it be ideal if Canada could contribute more to global supply? We've seen disruptions as a result of the Iran war. That has led to a real spike in oil prices, and that's going to lead to some real affordability pressures. The inflation numbers in Canada were actually down for February to 1.8%. But that's not taking into account everything that's happened since the start of this conflict with Iran, the surge in oil prices. And so you're going to see inflation, I think, much, much higher the next time we get the new batch of data. So this week, the Bank of Canada decided to hold the line on interest rates. 2.25% is the bank's key lending rate right now. And they're keeping an eye on all of this. I think given the circumstances, there's probably a limit in terms of what monetary policy can do right now to rein in inflation and to also recognize the potential impact of the economy and everything else that comes along with this kind of an oil price shock. But I think those concerns around inflation already we're seeing with gasoline, and I think you see a trickle-down effect when it comes to food prices and elsewhere in the economy, that you're going to see that reflected in inflation. So a real dilemma right now for the Bank of Canada in terms of how to manage all of this. And even before this crisis, we've been dealing with still real pressure on the food inflation side. So what does it all mean for Canadians? Where is all of this headed? Joining us for some further insights on all of these questions, we're very pleased to welcome to the program Steve Ambler. He's a fellow in residence at the CD Howe Institute, is also the David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy. And of course, they've been following all of this very closely. Much more at cdhowe.org. Steve Ambler, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me. Great pleasure to be with you.
So with everything going on right now, I guess maybe no surprise that the Bank of Canada held the line, but what do you think went into that decision?
All sorts of different factors. There's some of which you enumerated. I think before the spike in oil prices due to the invasion or the attack against Iran. Even then, I think markets were fairly convinced that the Bank of Canada would hold. Now that sort of turned around a little bit when we got the labor market figures last Friday, which showed a loss of 84,000 jobs in February, and the tick up in the unemployment rate from 6.5 to 6.7%. That's combined with the latest quarterly GDP numbers for the last quarter of last year, which showed a decline. And plus, there were, I think, the preliminary estimates for monthly GDP by industry for January is flat. Now, if we were to get 2 quarters in a row of negative negative GDP numbers, then we would be in what a lot of people would call a technical recession, which is not a good thing. And then on Monday, we got the latest inflation numbers, which were actually, I think, a little bit softer than the markets were predicting. So headline inflation went down from 2.3 to 1.8%, which is below target. So that would have been an added incentive to cut. But now with oil prices spiking above $100, and I think they just broke through 110 today, if I'm not mistaken, that's going to affect the March inflation numbers in a big way.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for the decline from 2.3 to 1.8 was year over year minus, I think it was about minus 18% change in gasoline prices. That's going to completely change or turn around in the following months.
Yeah. Well, it's not an ideal situation right now where there's concern about a weakening economy where, interest rates might go down to address that, but also concern about inflation. So you got both of these happening at the same time. What kind of a dilemma does that represent?
A big dilemma, I think, for the bank. I mean, the announcement and the press conference with the governor and the senior deputy governor talked about they emphasized the big increase in uncertainty. I mean, the big thing now is how long is this going to last? Are the Straits of Hormuz going to be blocked up for a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months? I mean, if it's really a temporary shock and the world economy can get the oil flowing again, it's going to be, it will impact things like gasoline prices almost immediately, but it won't last. On the other hand, if it persists, then the shock starts to filter through to basically all the other sectors of the economy. I mean, people talk a lot about oil prices, but there's a lot of inputs into for things like fertilizer that go through the Strait of Hormuz as well. So that's going to make crops more costly to sow this spring. It's going to increase transportation costs for food, even storing food on shelves, transforming food into final products. And we know that actually up until now, basically, it's actually high food inflation, the high rates of increase in food prices that have been driving higher inflation in Canada. So that's going to make things worse. But we're in a situation where, there's this, economists talk a lot about this distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risk is when you're facing, sort of known probabilities, like rolling a dice. It's a 1 in 6 chance if the die is fair that you're going to get a 1. But when you're talking about geopolitics, what are the probabilities that, the Strait of Hormuz will be opened up again in the next week or 10 days? Nobody knows, and you can't really assign any kind of meaningful probability to that. It's tough.
It is. And from the central bank's perspective, is there a limit when you have an external shock like this? We're subject to the global price of oil and the impact that has. Is there a limit to what monetary policy can do to address inflation in that context?
Oh, absolutely. It's what we call a supply side shock. It's the world, the Bank of Canada by itself, or even all central banks together in concert, cannot affect the world price of oil. So the question is, the best thing to do if the shock doesn't last for very long, the best thing to do is to look through it, to not react to it in any meaningful way, because it will go away. The danger, though, is the longer it lasts. As I said, that would feed through to costs in all sectors of the economy, and the big danger is that will eventually de-anchor inflation expectations. If prices go up a lot and it looks like they're going to keep increasing quite a bit, then that will feed through to when the price increases, when firms reset their prices. It will feed through to wage increases when firms and employees bargain on new wage deals, for example. So if inflation expectations increase, that's to a large extent self-fulfilling. Because the increasing wages and increasing price setting by firms means higher inflation.
Certainly. I mean, the Bank of Canada prior to all of this, managed to get inflation back toward that target range. But we've seen where there's still some pressures. We alluded to food inflation as an example, and no doubt now with higher transportation costs that could impact the price of food. But even before this, that's been a challenge. What's putting pressure on food prices? Why has that been so stubborn?
There's once again a number of different factors. I think it goes all the way back to the outbreak of the Ukraine war in 2022. I mean that put enormous pressure on things like fertilizer prices, and that fed through to food prices, and that's persisted over time. There's been some persistent drought, I think, in Western Canada as well. I think in one of our last pieces we wrote for the Globe and Mail, we noted that cattle stocks in Western Canada are lower than they've been since the 1980s. And that's put a lot of upward pressure on things like anybody who's been shopping recently knows that food is expensive, but beef is one of the things that's gone up the most. Last month, general inflation was 1.8. Food inflation was, I think, 4 point something. I think beef price increases were on the order of 8% year over year. So that's not helping at all. We've also got gradual increases or year over year increases in the industrial carbon tax. It's set to go up again in April from 70 some dollars a ton to 110, if memory serves. And that's going to feed through to all sorts of to the prices of production of all sorts of different goods. So that's not going to make anything better, for sure. And I mean, the last big element of uncertainty that we're facing is the fact that the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement comes up for mandatory review in July. And anybody's guess, once again, that's more uncertainty than risk. There's no way of predicting how that's going to pan out at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the industrial carbon tax, which I guess speaks to the question of where fiscal policy fits into all of this. We've got the monetary policy side. Now, fiscal policies might have different objectives. The carbon tax is maybe more of environmental policy. Maybe government is prioritizing affordability right now or economic growth. So part of it is, I guess, identifying what fiscal policy needs to address. But, with what's going on right now, where do you see fiscal policy fitting in alongside monetary policy?
Well, that's a very good question. And I mean, I think the federal government might be pursuing objectives which are not necessarily compatible, because wanting to boost investment and growth and attain better affordability, while at the same time ramping up the industrial carbon tax, that's something that doesn't jive together very well, I don't think.
Yeah, many big questions for sure right now. Much more on all of this. Again, cdhowe.org. Steve Ambler, really appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Okay, well, our thanks once again to Steve Ambler, as I mentioned, fellow in residence at the CD Howe Institute. Also there, David Dodge, chair in monetary policy. Some great insight from him on kind of the moment we're facing here. What's happening with oil prices, what that means for inflation and the economy, and just so much uncertainty about where all of this is headed, and a lot for the Bank of Canada and frankly for the federal government to consider. Now, here in Alberta, of course, those oil prices are a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, we feel the affordability pressures like everybody else, But of course, that also means additional revenue for the Alberta government. It's interesting to see that the massive swing from the budget that was tabled not long ago, where we're expecting $60 a barrel oil and a massive $9.4 billion deficit, to now see where oil prices have swung so quickly after, and perhaps a situation where that deficit is wiped out altogether. Now, back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices surged, the Alberta government paused the 13-cent per liter gasoline excise tax as a way of giving some price relief to consumers. I think there's going to be pressure on the Alberta government to do that once again. Now, there is still a formula that is in place that links the price of oil to where the gasoline tax is at. So that may kick in at some point anyway. But I think you're going to start to see those conversations in Alberta. And then maybe a broader conversation that needs to happen about this fiscal imbalance we have in Alberta between taxes and spending and our over-reliance on those energy revenues to balance the budget. But especially in a crisis like this, where there's those immediate affordability pressures and oil revenues are just kind of surging off the charts, to try to use some of that anyway to deal with the situation, ease some of those pressures. So we'll see how the Alberta government chooses to respond as well. So listen, that's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find us at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Rob Breakenridge Show, and on podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and the like. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. Again, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.